The night was silent, but the air was thick with fear. On a distant world, beneath the glow of twin moons, the cries of innocent children echoed through the streets of a small, helpless village. The darkness that had descended upon them was not just from the sky, it was something much worse. Shadows that moved, creatures that lurked just beyond the edge of light, and whispers in the dark that promised nothing but torment. For weeks, the village had been terrorized by a force that seemed to feed on the fear of its victims, a presence that was both invisible and all too real. The creatures, if you could even call them that, were relentless. They struck in the dead of night, snatching children from their beds, dragging them into the darkness, and leaving their parents to search in vain for signs of life. The village had once been peaceful, a place where children played in the fields, and the community came together to help one another. But now it was a place of mourning, where every household lived in constant dread. The creatures never left a trace, never showed themselves during the day. They were like ghosts, haunting the villagers' worst nightmares and turning their once vibrant world into a prison of terror. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown that paralyzed the people, it was the helplessness. The authorities had been contacted, but no one came. Messages sent to other villages went unanswered. The whispers among the villagers grew louder, with many saying that no one had ever faced a force like this and survived. It seemed like the creatures was something born of the darkest legends, ancient and untouchable. And then, just when it seemed that all hope was lost, when the last flicker of light seemed to fade from the hearts of the villagers, something unexpected happened. A ship, an enormous, gleaming vessel, broke through the clouds, its engines roaring with a power unlike anything they had ever seen. At first, the villagers didn't know what to make of it. Was it a rescue? Or was it yet another threat, something even worse than what they had already endured? But the ship landed softly, and from it emerged not an army of invaders, but humans. Men and women, hardened by battles they had fought across countless worlds, walked into the village with a single purpose: to put an end to the terror that had taken so much. The villagers, still frozen in fear, could only watch as these strangers moved through their broken streets with a confidence that was almost foreign. The humans had come from far away, driven by stories of the suffering of the innocent. They were not there for conquest, not for control. They were there for one reason, and one reason only: to protect the children and to put an end to the nightmare. But as the humans surveyed the village and prepared for the confrontation, they knew this wouldn't be an easy fight. The creatures they were about to face were not like anything they had encountered before. These were predators that thrived on fear, who knew how to vanish in an instant, to strike without warning. The humans would have to rely not just on their weapons, but on something deeper, something they knew all too well: the will to fight for the innocent, for those who could not protect themselves. In the dead of night, when the creatures would come again, the humans would be ready. But as the villagers hid in their homes, the shadows shifted. The creatures were no longer hiding, they were coming, moving faster, smarter, more dangerous than before. Their eyes glowed with a terrible hunger, and their movements were precise, methodical. This wasn't just a hunt, it was a war. The humans, though, weren't afraid. They had faced worse, fought against enemies far more terrifying than these. And as they prepared for the coming battle, they knew that the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. This wasn't just about stopping monsters. This was about saving lives, about ensuring that no child would have to suffer the same fate as those who had already been taken. As the moonlight cast long shadows over the village, A single thought crossed the minds of the humans. They were not here to just defend. They were here to reclaim hope. The creatures, though relentless, didn't understand the force they were about to face. They had terrorized the village for so long. They believed the humans were just another fleeting hope, a foolish attempt to stop them. But they didn't know what these humans were capable of. They didn't know that humanity had faced impossible odds before and had never backed down. Now, as the night grew darker and the first whispers of the creatures began to stir, the tension in the village reached a breaking point. The humans prepared themselves, setting traps, positioning themselves in the streets, and waiting for the inevitable. What they didn't know was that the creatures had been watching them. They knew the humans would fight. The silence before the storm was deafening. The villagers, once so afraid to leave their homes, now gathered together in the safety of the humans' protection. But even they knew that this night would be different. It would either end in the destruction of the terror that had gripped their world, or in an even darker fate. As the creatures closed in, moving like a storm through the streets, the humans stood tall, ready to defend. The first wave of monsters rushed forward, but the humans were prepared. Weapons fired, traps were triggered, and the night exploded into chaos. Yet even as the battle raged, it was clear that the creatures weren't retreating. They were adapting, and with every passing moment, it seemed they grew stronger, faster, and more cunning. But just as the humans began to doubt their chances, the true nature of the enemy revealed itself. The creatures weren't just beasts, they were something more, something far more dangerous. They were not of this world, not entirely. And this knowledge would force the humans to adapt quickly, to change their tactics on the fly. The battle was just beginning. With every passing second, the tension mounted. The humans had made it this far, but could they really stop the creatures before it was too late? Would the villagers ever truly be free from the terror that had haunted them for so long? The answer lay in the heart of the battle. And as the humans advanced, their resolve stronger than ever, they knew one thing for sure: the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The humans moved through the darkened streets with precision. They had fought enemies before enemies, with weapons, armies, and grand designs. But nothing had prepared them for this. These creatures, born from the deepest shadows, were unlike anything they had ever encountered. They were intelligent, cunning, and, worst of all, they were driven by something far older and more primal than any mortal fear. As the night deepened, the humans realized that defeating these creatures would require more than just firepower or strategy. It would demand something far more fundamental: understanding. The creatures weren't just predators, they were survivors. There was a strange intelligence behind their attacks, an unspoken coordination that seemed to grow with each encounter. It was almost as if they were studying their enemies, adapting to the humans' tactics and learning from their mistakes. It became clear to the humans that this wasn't a mere fight for survival. It was a war of wills. The villagers, huddled together in their homes, had little understanding of the true nature of their tormentors. They only knew the fear, the helplessness, and the growing sense of dread that had consumed their lives for weeks. Children had vanished without a trace, their screams swallowed by the night, and their parents had been left to endure the agony of uncertainty. The once vibrant village was now a hollow shell of what it had been, its people living in the constant shadow of terror. But the humans weren't here to mourn. They weren't here to be afraid. They had come for one thing: to end the nightmare. As the humans advanced through the streets, they could feel the weight of the village's suffering. It wasn't just the terror of the creatures that had worn down the villagers, it was the sense of abandonment. For weeks, no help had come. Their cries for assistance had been ignored, their pleas for protection unanswered. But now, the humans had arrived, and with them came a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, the villagers dared to believe that they might not be entirely alone. They might not have to fight this battle in the dark. But the creatures weren't going to let go of their prey so easily. They had learned from their previous encounters with the humans, and they were ready to escalate their tactics. No longer would they just lurk in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now, they were on the offensive. They moved faster, more aggressively, as though they were preparing for the final, decisive assault. The humans quickly realized that the battle wasn't going to be over quickly. The creatures had a deep understanding of fear, and they used it as a weapon. They would strike at the hearts of their enemies, not just their bodies. As the humans set their traps and prepared for the inevitable clash, they couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. There was something wrong here, something deeper than they had anticipated. These creatures weren't just feeding off fear. They were manipulating it, controlling it, and using it as a weapon to break their enemies. The humans gathered in the village square, speaking in low, urgent voices. They had to come up with a plan, and they had to do it quickly. The creatures were getting closer, their presence felt in every creak of the floorboards and every rustle in the trees. It was as if the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. "We need to get them to show themselves," one of the humans said. A woman with short-cropped hair and a scar that ran across her cheek. "We can't fight what we can't see." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement. The creatures had been terrifying because they were unpredictable, elusive, and quick. But the humans had a secret weapon, their ability to think beyond the obvious. They had faced enemies that hid in shadows, and they knew that in order to defeat them, they had to force them into the light. They began laying out traps in the streets, setting up false signals to draw the creatures out. They knew the creatures would be watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The humans had to stay calm, stay patient, and wait for the perfect opportunity to hit back. But as they prepared for the coming battle, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The creatures weren't acting like animals. They were acting like something more. There was an intelligence to their movements, a strategy that made them far more dangerous than mere beasts. It wasn't just about survival for them. It was about domination. And the humans, despite their training and experience, knew that they were playing a game with stakes far higher than they had anticipated. As the night stretched on, the villagers stayed hidden, watching from their windows as the humans set their traps and prepared to face the creatures head-on. The tension was thick in the air, like a storm waiting to break. No one spoke much. Words felt pointless in the face of the terror they were all about to face. The only sound was the steady thrum of the humans' preparation, the hum of weapons being checked, the soft murmur of plans being made. And then the first scream cut through the silence. It wasn't from a child. It wasn't from the villagers. It came from the humans themselves. A figure, a shadow darted through the darkness, faster than human eyes could track. It was no longer a mere creature. It had become something far more dangerous, something that the humans had not expected. It was almost like the creatures had anticipated their every move, like they were one step ahead. And in that moment, the humans knew they were no longer just fighting for the village, they were fighting for their lives. The traps had been set, but now the creatures were coming from every direction. They moved like liquid shadows, sliding between the streets, blending into the night. They were everywhere and nowhere. Each movement, each noise, only heightened the tension. It was impossible to know where the next attack would come from. It felt as if the creatures were everywhere, surrounding them, suffocating them with their presence. But the humans had been trained for this. They had faced worse. They had survived battles that would have broken lesser beings. They would not let fear take control. The battle had just begun, but they weren't backing down. The fight would be long. It would be hard. But one thing was certain. They weren't going to let these creatures destroy the last shred of hope the village had left. The tension continued to rise as the creatures closed in, but the humans' resolve was just beginning to harden. The first clash of the battle echoed through the streets like thunder, and the humans knew that there was no turning back now. They were committed. The creatures had taken their best shot, but the humans were about to show them something they had never seen before. The creatures surged forward from the darkness, their movements sharp and erratic, like predators sensing their prey. The humans stood firm, weapons raised, hearts pounding, eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The tension was unbearable. Each second felt like an eternity. They had trained for this, but nothing had prepared them for the sheer malice these creatures exuded. It wasn't just the size, or the speed, or even the way they moved. No. It was their relentless drive to strike at the heart of their enemies. They were toying with the humans now, testing their resolve, waiting to strike where it would hurt the most. The humans had been clever, laying traps and setting decoys to draw the creatures out. They had forced their hand, made them show themselves, but it was clear that these creatures were no longer making mistakes. Every trap set off a chain of events, each one triggering a new wave of terror as the creatures learned and adapted faster than anyone had expected. They weren't just terrorizing the village anymore. They were making a statement, proving they were in control. Suddenly, the night was broken by a sharp scream. One of the humans, caught off guard, went down. The others immediately rushed to his side, firing wildly into the shadows. But the creature had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. There was no trace, no sign of where it had gone, only the hollow echo of its laughter, cold and mocking. The humans tried to steady themselves, tried to regain their focus, but it was hard. The fear, once manageable, was now crawling up their spines. The creatures weren't just attacking physically, they were attacking mentally. With every shadow that shifted, every flicker of movement, the humans could feel their confidence beginning to wane. It was as if the creatures were feeding off their anxiety, growing stronger with every ounce of fear that they could sense. One of the humans, a man who had been quiet until now, spoke up, his voice shaking. "We can't let them break us. If we give in, they win. We need to stay together." His words, though simple, cut through the tension like a knife. The others nodded, rallying around him, forcing themselves to push the fear aside. They knew that if they allowed the creatures to control their minds, it would be over. The fight wasn't just physical, it was mental, and the creatures were masters of this kind of war. But the humans had something the creatures didn't: unity. They weren't alone in this battle. They had each other. As they regrouped, the humans moved into position, forming a tight perimeter around the village center. They couldn't afford to be scattered now. The creatures, relentless and cunning, would strike from every angle, but they had to be ready. They had to be fast. But the more they prepared, the more it felt like the creatures were already inside their heads, inside their thoughts, like a dark presence watching, waiting for them to make the wrong move. The air seemed heavier now, suffused with the weight of what was about to come. The creatures were no longer simply lurking in the dark. They were attacking in waves, driving the humans into corners, forcing them to fight on multiple fronts. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the humans refused to break. They fought with everything they had, their weapons cutting through the shadows, but it wasn't enough. Every time they pushed one creature back, two more seemed to appear in its place. The villagers, once huddled in fear, now watched with a mixture of awe and terror as the humans held their ground. The villagers had never seen anything like this before. These strangers, these warriors from beyond their world, were fighting for them, for their children, for their future. And yet, they knew that this wasn't going to be a victory won easily. The creatures were growing bolder, their attacks more synchronized. They weren't just striking for the sake of fear, they were pushing, pressing, seeking the one weakness they hadn't yet exploited. Then, just when it seemed like the humans might be getting a foothold, something changed. There was a sudden shift in the air, a moment of stillness that sent a chill down everyone's spine. The creatures, once frenzied, seemed to pause, as though waiting for something. The humans were on edge, unsure if this was a trap, but they didn't have time to second guess. The ground trembled beneath their feet. A low rumble reverberated through the air, like the earth itself was groaning under the weight of what was about to happen. In the distance, beyond the village, something massive stirred. The humans didn't have time to react before a deafening roar split the night, sending a shockwave through the village. The creatures weren't just attacking now. They were calling reinforcements. And these were not the same creatures they had been fighting before. Out of the shadows, from the depths of the darkened woods beyond the village, emerged something far larger, far more terrifying than anything the humans had faced so far. These new creatures were massive, their forms shadowed but unmistakable, towering beasts that seemed to glide through the air, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness like beacons. The ground shook as they landed, their claws scraping the earth with terrifying force. The humans stood frozen for a moment, their weapons aimed at the incoming threat, but for the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. This was a level of danger they had not prepared for. These weren't just predators, they were hunters, ancient and powerful, with an intelligence that surpassed their own. But as the first of the new creatures stepped forward, the humans knew they couldn't hesitate. They had already fought too hard. There was no turning back now. The battle intensified. The air was thick with the sounds of gunfire, the shrieks of creatures, the crackling of energy weapons. The villagers, watching from their windows, could only pray that the humans could hold their own against this new wave of horror. The night had become a battlefield, and with every moment, the tension grew tighter. The humans were pushing back, but they were being pushed harder. It was as though the creatures had sensed their fear and were feeding off it, becoming stronger with every passing second. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a sharp, high-pitched cry echoed across the battlefield. It was not the cry of the creatures, but of something else, something human. One of the villagers had been taken. A child. The humans paused for a moment, and in that moment, everything seemed to come into sharp focus. They couldn't afford to falter now. The stakes had never been higher. The creatures had taken far too much already. And if they were going to have any chance at winning this battle, they needed to do more than fight. They needed to break the creatures' hold over the village once and for all. But how? How could they defeat something so powerful, so relentless, and so deeply embedded in the very fabric of the night? The answer, it seemed, was just out of reach. The humans could feel it, the tipping point approaching, but they weren't quite sure where the final blow would come from. All they knew was that this night wasn't over, and the creatures were far from finished. The human soldiers were reeling from the sudden loss. The child had been snatched in a blur of motion, too fast for anyone to stop. Panic began to spread, a wave of unease rippling through the humans as they realized just how little control they truly had. The creatures were not merely after power or survival. They were hunting, playing with their prey, manipulating every emotion, every ounce of desperation that they could feel in the hearts of the humans. They knew how to use fear to their advantage, and they were masters at it. The child's cry echoed in the night air, a haunting sound that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. It wasn't just a plea for help. It was a signal, a warning, a reminder of how far the creatures had come. The humans' mission was no longer just about survival. It was about saving whatever was left of the village, of the people. As the humans tried to regroup, they realized the odds had suddenly shifted. What had been a scattered assault of swift creatures now seemed like a coordinated offensive, a strategy that far surpassed anything the humans had encountered before. They had expected the creatures to be primitive, driven by instinct alone, but these attacks were different. The creatures were adapting to their every move, using the human strengths against them. Then, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. The shadows, once filled with movement and violence, seemed to settle. The creatures paused in their pursuit, watching from the darkness, as if waiting for something. The humans tensed, unsure of what this sudden calm meant. It was almost as if the creatures were regrouping, strategizing, preparing for a new phase of the battle. But no one could predict what was coming next. A low hum reverberated through the ground. It wasn't the sound of battle. It was something else. A strange, almost otherworldly frequency that seemed to vibrate in the very air. The humans exchanged uneasy glances. Was it some sort of signal? Were the creatures calling for reinforcements again? Then, with a suddenness that left them breathless, the ground beneath their feet shifted violently. The earth cracked open, a deep rift splitting through the center of the village. Dust and debris filled the air as the humans stumbled back, their eyes wide in shock. From the depths of the rift emerged something that none of them had prepared for, a creature far more immense than any they had encountered before. It wasn't just a single being. It was a massive, dark shape, surrounded by a swirling mass of creatures that moved in and out of the rift like shadows in the storm. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The humans stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. This creature, this new, gargantuan figure, was unlike anything they had fought before. It was no longer just a terror lurking in the shadows. It was a force, something that had been waiting, building, growing stronger beneath the earth. The creature, towering and powerful, stepped forward with a slow, deliberate motion, its glowing eyes scanning the humans. It wasn't just an animal. It was intelligent. It was a leader. And it was here to finish what the others had started. The humans could feel the weight of its gaze, like a predator sizing up its prey. The ground trembled beneath their feet again, and for a moment, the humans felt the crushing weight of their situation. They were no longer fighting to defend the village, they were fighting to survive. The creature, with its immense power, had thrown the balance of the battle into chaos. The other creatures had been a distraction, a prelude to this moment, a testing of the human strength. But now, the true battle had begun. The soldiers instinctively fell back into formation, weapons raised, but they knew this wasn't going to be enough. They had faced horrors before, but this creature was something else entirely. It was no longer about winning, it was about holding their ground, about stopping the inevitable advance of this new enemy that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. And just when it seemed like the humans might be overwhelmed, something else happened. From behind them, from the darkest corners of the village, a new sound echoed. It was a noise unlike anything they had heard before, almost like a scream, but with a deeper, more guttural quality. As they turned to face the source, they saw something that made their blood run cold. The villagers, the people they had been fighting for, were moving. They weren't running in fear, as the humans had expected. They were walking toward the rift, their faces blank, their movements slow, as though they were being drawn in by some unseen force. They had become something else, something that looked human, but was no longer entirely human. The creatures, it seemed, had already begun to turn the villagers into something new. They weren't just victims anymore. They were part of the enemy. The humans watched in horror as the villagers, their friends, their families, began to take up positions beside the creatures, aligning themselves with the very force that had been terrorizing them for weeks. This wasn't just a battle for survival anymore. This was a battle for the soul of the village. The humans had to make a choice. Would they fight to save the village, or would they have to destroy it to prevent the creatures from spreading their influence even further? The immense creature, its glowing eyes never leaving the humans, gave a low, resonant growl. The ground seemed to shake with its power, and the humans could feel the weight of the decision they had to make pressing down on them. If they didn't act now, if they didn't find a way to break the connection between the creatures and the villagers, they might be fighting a battle that was already lost. They had no choice but to fight back. The humans tightened their grip on their weapons and prepared for the impossible. The rift was still growing, the creatures still advancing, and the villagers, those who hadn't been turned, were still hiding in fear. There was no time left. It was now or never. The fight was escalating, the stakes higher than ever. The final confrontation had arrived, but the humans had no idea just how deep the darkness ran or what price they would have to pay to stop it. The tension in the air was suffocating as the humans faced the monstrosity before them. The towering creature, still emerging from the rift, seemed to watch them with unblinking, malevolent eyes. Its presence was a heavy weight on the soldiers' hearts. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and in the distance, they could hear the villagers, those who had been corrupted, moving closer, their blank faces locked in a trance. The creatures were no longer just monsters. They were puppeteers, and the village was their stage. The humans had no time to dwell on their fear. They could feel the energy around them shifting, the air thick with the creature's power. The massive creature in front of them was a leader, its energy infecting everything around it, transforming the villagers, turning them into something less than human. The soldiers had to act fast, or they would lose everything. Without warning, the humans launched forward, charging at the enormous creature with a force they hadn't realized they were capable of. Gunfire rang out. Flashes of light illuminated the battlefield, and the earth trembled beneath their feet as the massive creature roared in defiance. Its form shifted, growing even larger as it absorbed the power from the rift, a dark aura expanding from it. The soldiers moved as one, coordinated in a way they hadn't been earlier, knowing that there was no retreat this time. They had to win, there was no other option. The massive creature snarled, its sharp claws cutting through the air. The humans fought back with everything they had. Each strike, each shot was fueled by the desperation of not just survival, but by the memory of those who had been lost. But for every creature they took down, another seemed to appear in its place. The rift wasn't just a portal, it was a breeding ground, and it was spitting out more horrors with every passing second. But then, just when it seemed like the humans might be overrun, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath their feet rumbled once again, but this time, it wasn't just the creature causing the disturbance. From the depths of the earth, something stirred a low, resonant hum, like a heartbeat. The humans, exhausted and bloodied, paused for a moment. They looked to the rift, their eyes wide with confusion. What was happening now? The rift began to contract, the dark aura that had been expanding now pulling back. It was as if the energy was being siphoned into something within the rift itself. And then, the truth hit them. The creatures had been using the rift to draw power, yes, but they weren't the only ones capable of tapping into it. The humans had unknowingly been standing at the edge of something far more ancient than they could have imagined. Something was fighting back against the creatures, and it wasn't the humans. The creatures seemed to sense this too. The massive one in front of them let out a roar, one that seemed to reverberate through the very bones of the earth. It was a sound of fear, a sound of confusion. And in that moment, the creatures faltered. The rift began to crack, and from the shattered pieces, a new presence emerged, something colossal, something unimaginable. The humans stared in disbelief as an ancient being, far older than the creatures themselves, emerged from the depths. Its form was hazy at first, like a shifting shadow, but its power was undeniable. The being towered over the battlefield, its presence overwhelming the darkness that had once been so dominant. It was as if the earth itself had risen up to fight back against the creatures, as though nature itself had grown tired of the invasion. The massive creature in front of them, the one that had led the charge against the humans, seemed to shrink in comparison. It let out a final desperate scream before it crumbled under the immense pressure of the new arrival. The rift pulsated one last time, and the creatures that had corrupted the villagers began to shrink, their bodies fading away as if they had never been there in the first place. The battle was over. The earth was still, the creatures vanquished. But as the humans stood there, panting and bleeding, they knew that this victory wasn't theirs alone. They had merely played a part in something far larger than themselves. The ancient being had saved them, but it had not done so out of kindness. No, it had acted to preserve balance, to stop the creatures from corrupting the land. The rift, once a doorway for the creatures to invade, had been sealed, but the forces that had shaped it had not been fully understood. In the distance, the villagers who had been turned slowly began to stir. The blank, trance-like expressions on their faces began to soften, their eyes blinking as they regained control over their own bodies. It was a strange, eerie moment, as though the villagers were waking from a long nightmare. But the humans knew that the battle was far from over. The rift had closed, but the darkness that had poured from it was far from gone. The land was scarred. Just when they thought the story was over, a final twist revealed itself. As the humans regrouped, catching their breath, they realized something chilling. The ancient being that had appeared from the depths was not gone. It lingered, watching them, its form now clearer, more defined. Its eyes, glowing faintly with an ancient light, studied the humans with a strange, inscrutable gaze. And then it spoke, its voice low and rumbling, vibrating the very air around them. This is only the beginning. The humans froze. The battle had ended, yes. But there was no peace. The rift might have closed, but the ancient being had made it clear something far more dangerous was on the horizon. And as the humans exchanged nervous glances, they understood the gravity of those words. They hadn't won. They had only survived. The true test was still to come. The world, it seemed, was about to change in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The creatures had been defeated, but something much darker was now watching them, waiting. The humans had to be ready for what was to come, even if they didn't fully understand it. And as they stood on the battlefield, unsure of what the future held, they knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning of a much larger war. The humans stood in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of the ancient being's ominous declaration. The battlefield was still, the rift sealed, but a sense of unease lingered in the air, thick and palpable. The survivors, those who had fought and bled, shared uneasy glances, unsure of what the being meant by its cryptic words. The creatures were gone. The villagers who had been under their sway were slowly regaining their senses, but something told them that this was far from over. The presence of the ancient entity, now looming over them, added to the tension, a constant reminder that they had yet to face their greatest trial. As the village began to settle, the humans gathered, their minds racing. The ancient being didn't seem to move, but its gaze never wavered, its presence oppressive and watching. It wasn't a creature of flesh and blood, but something older, something far beyond the comprehension of the humans standing before it. They were like ants to it, insignificant and small. But there was something in the way it had helped them, something that sparked a flicker of hope. "What do you want from us?" One of the soldiers finally spoke, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. His grip on his weapon tightened, but he made no move to attack. The being before them wasn't an enemy, but it was certainly no ally. They needed answers, and they needed them now. The ancient being did not respond immediately, its gaze fixed on the humans, its form shifting in the dark air like smoke. Then, with a low, rumbling voice, it spoke again, a deep, ancient sound that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. "You have survived this day because the balance has been restored," it said, its words reverberating in the humans' bones. "The creatures that terrorized your world were but a small part of a much greater disturbance, one that you are not yet equipped to fully understand." A chill ran down the spine of everyone present. The rift was closed, the creatures gone, but this was far from the resolution they had hoped for. The soldiers exchanged looks, trying to grasp what the being was telling them. There was more to this story, something deeper, and they had unwittingly become part of it. The leader of the human soldiers, his face worn and tired from the battle, stepped forward. "What is this disturbance you speak of?" he asked, his voice hoarse but firm. "If we've only scratched the surface, then we need to know what we're facing. If the world is truly at risk, we have to be ready." The ancient being was silent for a long moment, as if considering the soldier's question. Then it spoke again, its voice almost like a whisper, though it filled the entire space. "The creatures you faced were merely pawns, warriors sent to reclaim what was once theirs. The rift you closed is but a doorway, a thin veil between your world and others. The forces you defeated are but a fraction of a greater power, one that has been stirring for centuries. And now it will seek to reclaim what it believes belongs to it." The humans stood in stunned silence. The weight of the words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment it felt as though the very ground beneath their feet might give way. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The ancient being continued, its presence growing more intense as it spoke. "Your world has always been a part of a much larger universe. The rift you closed was not the only one. There are others, hidden from your eyes, waiting. The creatures you faced were but the vanguard, the beginning of something far more dangerous. And now they will return, stronger, more relentless than before. The humans were now faced with an undeniable truth. This battle was only the start of a much larger war, one that they were woefully unprepared for. The creatures were just the beginning of an invasion that could threaten the entire planet. The ancient being had spoken of balance, but it had also made it clear that the humans were not the ones in control of their fate. "Why us?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice cracking with the weight of the question. "Why have we been dragged into this? We're just humans. Why do we have to fight this battle?" The ancient being's gaze softened, a strange sadness crossing its ethereal features. "Because your world has something that others do not. A power, a strength. Your species is unlike any other in the universe. You do not have the greatest physical might, nor do you possess the most advanced technology. But you have something far more important: resilience. The ability to adapt, to grow, to learn from your mistakes. That is why you are needed." The humans were silent as they processed the being's words. Their species had often been underestimated, dismissed by others as weak or primitive. But they had proven time and time again that they could rise to the occasion, that they could endure, adapt, and overcome. It wasn't their weapons or their technology that had won the day. It was their will to survive, their determination to protect those they loved. But now, it seemed that their resilience would be tested in ways they couldn't even imagine. The creatures, the rift, and the ancient being were only the beginning of a much larger conflict. The fate of their world rested in their hands, and they weren't ready. Not yet. The ancient being seemed to sense their uncertainty. "There is still time. You are not alone in this. I will offer guidance, but it will be up to you to find the strength to stand against the darkness that comes. This world can still be saved, but only if you are willing to fight." The humans were left with no choice but to accept the truth. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The world they knew was about to change, and the forces arrayed against them were unlike anything they had ever faced. As the ancient being began to fade back into the shadows, its final words echoed in their minds. "Remember, humanity's greatest strength lies in its ability to rise, no matter how dark the night. But you must be ready. The creatures are just the beginning." The soldiers looked at each other, knowing that their next steps would determine the future of their world. The village, once peaceful and safe, now seemed like a distant memory. They had lost so much, but they had gained something else, a purpose. They were no longer just defending their home. They were defending the very fabric of reality itself. As the humans prepared for the challenges ahead, they knew they couldn't face this threat alone. They would have to unite, not just with each other, but with the forces that lay hidden in the universe. The creatures had been just the beginning, but there was much more to come. And humanity would be ready, because they had no choice. The battle was over for now, but the true war was just beginning. The fate of the world rested in their hands, and they would not falter. They would stand strong, as they always had, ready to face whatever darkness lay ahead. Because, in the end, humans didn't just survive, they conquered. And they always would.